this video I am bringing you all of my spoilery thoughts while reading Dust of Dreams by Steven Erikson, the 9th book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series. If you are watching this video, I'm going to go ahead and assume that this isn't the first of my Malazan videos that you're watching, but if it is, I will have the playlist linked in the description just in case you would like to catch up. But this video is going to be structured how I usually structure these videos. I'm going to bring you updates at the end of each part. So at the time of filming, I am at the end of part 1 and it's time for me to share my initial impressions. I was a little bit nervous going into Dust of Dreams for two reasons. The first is that some people have told me that this isn't generally considered a favourite book in the Malazan universe. A lot of people, for some reason, don't love this one, and there is an author's note at the beginning from Steven Erikson where he explains that he intended for Dust of Dreams and the Crippled God to be one volume. I think that's maybe the main reason why some people don't love this one, but I'm going into this expecting that there's not going to be a satisfying conclusion and that I'm going to want to go straight into the Crippled God, and hopefully that's going to deliver the satisfying moments that I'm waiting for. Not that there haven't been satisfying moments in the series so far, but I'm expecting that's where everything is going to come together. The other reason I was a bit nervous going into this is because it is continuing some of the storylines from Reaper's Gale, and so far Reaper's Gale is one of my least favourite books in the series. There were certain storylines that I found a bit boring and a bit confusing, and we have returned to some of those storylines and I'm enjoying them a little better actually. I'm enjoying Dust of Dreams a lot more than I was maybe expecting, possibly because so many people were warning me, so my expectations were a bit lower. Also, Toll the Hounds is I think my favourite book in the series, so I'm still hyped up after finishing that even though it's been a few months now. I think a good place to start is with the prologue. So the prologue hooked me in straight away. There was some new stuff that was introduced, but there's a particular region of this continent that keeps being mentioned, and it's the region to the far east, specifically Calans, or Calans, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but one of the first things that we're following in the prologue is this snake, these children who, I don't know if I've quite followed, but they're walking through the wastelands, and it seems like something tragic has happened. I'm assuming that's going to be elaborated on as we get further into the book, but we were also introduced to Caliph, who is a new character. She is the Destrian of the Kachain Chamale, and she's also from an area near Calans. I think it mentioned she's the last of her people and they were called the Elan, or maybe that's the name of the region that they're from, and she seems to be feeling a lot of survivor's guilt. I think she's quite an interesting character. You can kind of feel how worn down she is and how she's almost going through the motions. The matron of the Kachain Chamale is, I mean, there's something going on there. She is breeding and breeding and breeding, preparing for a war that they believe is coming. The Kell Hunters from Reaper's Gale, who were with the All, have returned to the matron and she's disappointed in them because they've failed, and that's how she comes to the decision to send out Caliph with these Kell Hunters, and the idea is that she's going to recruit a mortal sword and a shield anvil. Caliph doesn't really want to do this, but also she doesn't know what else to do, and I'm still trying to work her out. Like I said, I do think she's an interesting character and I'm intrigued to see where her storyline is going to go, because we're getting her perspective, but we've also got the perspective of these Kell Hunters. There's a lot to do with the Kachain Chamale that I feel we still don't know, but I do find them one of the most interesting races within Malazan, especially how they seem to have a lot of technology. At one point, Caliph performs this ritual to go into this realm, I think it's a realm, where Heberic is. Heberic is just ranting and ranting and ranting, and Caliph is confused. This links back to something from book 4 that I have been waiting for. Heberic, I highlighted this passage where I think he's talking about the Otataral dragon from book 4. He says, "It appears dead, spiked so cruelly. Do not be deceived, she will be freed." I think that's foreshadowing the destruction of the Warrens, because back in book 4, when Pearl and Lestara came across this dragon that was like crucified, they were talking about how if it were released, then the Ottertarl would destroy all of the Warrens. And there seems to be this recurring theme within the book around the old versus the new, evolution and change. It kind of links into what Akarium did at the end of Book 7, Reaper's Gale, when he seemed to create some new Warrens, which I think has been confirmed, or at least it's been discussed among the Malazans. It's a really great image, actually, of the Holds and then the Warrens and then whatever Akarium has done, kind of building upon building upon building the same pattern, but something didn't quite go right there. And so I'm wondering whether, yeah, like something is going to happen with the Warrens. There have been so many discussions around starting anew, starting afresh. In fact, it's kind of been implied that maybe that's what Shadowthrone's plan is. One of my favourite scenes so far was the reading of the deck and how Fiddler didn't want to do it, how he showed up and saw there were 13 people and thought, no, this is a bad omen. And just the intensity and the build up to that I thought was really well done. I haven't written down every single card that every single character got, but I did pick out that Quickben got the Magus of Dark. And one of the other characters, I can't remember their name, was talking about how that makes no sense because Quickben isn't Tistandi. And so initially I was thinking, well, could he be Tistandi? But then I remembered he has all of these souls inside of him and that's how he can use multiple Warrens. And so maybe one of the souls that he consumed was Tistandi. Devor didn't get a card and I don't know what that means. The characters seem to understand the implications of that, but they're not sharing it with me right now. So we're just going to roll with that. We have learned that their plan is to travel across the wastelands through these other kingdoms to get to Clans, which is where parts of the crippled god have landed. Everything seems to be converging on this particular area of this continent. In order to get there, they're going to need to travel through, I think it's pronounced the Bolcando kingdom, and there's been some really interesting politics to do with the Bolcando and the Greyhelms, the Burnt Tears as well. I loved that scene. In fact, there were several scenes where we had the, it wasn't the Destrian actually of the Greyhelms has died, but he tried to warn the Shield Anvil saying that she will betray you. And I don't know who she refers to, but I'm wondering if it links into what Silchas Ruin was saying earlier. I feel like there's a few characters that have mentioned she, and I don't know who they're referring to, but Silchas Ruin at one point said she will be queen. So I'm wondering whether we're going to have a woman who betrays the Greyhounds in order to become queen. I'm sure there was a part with Grub and Sin where they were also talking about she, and I don't know if it's the same she or whether these are different women. I feel like that's also foreshadowing something, I just don't know what yet. Shield Anvil is keeping it to himself, but right now he doesn't feel like it's necessary to share with everyone else. But yeah, there was a great scene where the Mortal Sword, she was talking to the representatives of the Bolcando kingdom and they were anticipating that maybe there was going to be a betrayal there. And we also saw the other side, we saw the representatives planning to betray the Grey Helms. I keep wanting to call them the Grey Swords, but that's wrong. Yeah, that whole scene I thought was so well done. At one point, they were talking about the Malazans and how they intended to betray the Malazans, but as long as the Lethari didn't get involved, and we know that Bryce is accompanying the Malazans as they cross through. I love politics in fantasy and seeing those manoeuvrings, and yeah, that, considering at least initially when the Grey Helms came back into it, I was a little bit, not confused, but it took me a while to remember who they were. They are the ones who worship or follow the wolf gods. Again, this kind of links into what I was saying about new versus old and evolution, how we've had so many different war gods that have been introduced. We've had Fenner, we've had Togan Fandre, we've had, can I remember his name? One of the main questions I have right now is what has happened to Gano's Paran? Because the last time we saw him, we technically saw him in Toll the Hounds when he seemed to be locked in this fight, this battle. I don't know where in the timeline this is taking place in comparison to Toll the Hounds, but that was the last time we saw Paran. Before then, the last time we saw him was when he was leaving Seven Cities with an army. Is he going to show up in this book? He's been mentioned because the Errant is doing something. He showed up at the reading of the deck and we know that he tried to kill Bryce. Again, it links back into what I was saying about about the old versus the new, an evolution, the errant versus the master of the deck, and the errant trying to retain some kind of control. Oh, it's really interesting. I love all of that stuff. The final thing that I wanted to talk about is the Sheikh. So this is another storyline that started in book 7. I think it started in book 7, but it was mostly in book 7. We have Yantovis, aka Twilight. She is the queen of the Sheikh, and her brother in this book kills all of the witches because they oppose her rule, and he is very dedicated. He seems to have an idea of what they are meant to be doing as a group of people. Yantovis seems to disagree with him though. There was an interesting part that I highlighted. She said something about how she's going to open the road to Galan, to the Dark Shore. I'm taking us home. I feel like that's a warren, because the only thing I can think of when it talks about opening something is a warren. My memory from book 7 is that the Sheikh was somehow connected to the Kchain Chamale. Maybe they're descended from them. I also thought maybe they were descended from the Teast in some way, but it's been a few months since I read Reaper's Gale, so I wasn't sure if I was misremembering, but the Sheikh, I'm sure, are somehow linked to one of these other races, and I'm not quite able to put it all together in my brain yet. But yeah, this has been interesting so far. Very much looking forward to reading part 2, which I'm going to start this evening, and then I will check in with you hopefully in a couple of days. I've reached the end of part 2, and the good news is I'm still quite enjoying this. Compared to Reaper's Gale, there have been fewer moments where I felt a little bit bored or where I found things a bit tedious. I feel like I'm generally following everything, and there's a lot of politics in this, specifically to do with this one particular area. I think I've already touched on this, but there's a particular region where the Bolkando kingdom is. I think it's called the Akrin. Barghast are also in this area, and we're learning so much more about the Barghast and their culture, which has been fascinating. There was a particular conversation that I really appreciated where it was talking about the whole reason that the Barghast have come to this continent is because they feel entitled to this particular area of land where they originated from or where they used to live. I think the Barghast are descended from the Imas, and I think the Imas used to live on this particular continent. There was this whole discussion about how so many other people, other groups of people also have claim to this area of land. I think it was Toll who was thinking about how the Barghast seems so unwilling to evolve. The whole reason that they left Genebakis was because their culture was coming to an end. They're unwilling to change, and they're still stuck in their old ways, and I think that just ties into the overall theme, or one of the themes of this book. Out of all of the books in this series so far, this is the book where I feel like I have no issue identifying the main themes that Erikson is trying to talk about, specifically to do with evolution, change, people who seem stuck and people who are unwilling to move forward. Toll even warned a group of Barghast, I think it was the Senon tribe, warned them that they're going to die unless they contact the Lethari and form an agreement with them. I will say that Toll's death to me felt a bit anticlimactic. I didn't really feel much there, possibly because I think I talked about this in one of the previous books with Tok's death. I feel like sometimes too much time passes between us following a character initially and then the conclusion of their arc. I found that with Tok, where we were introduced to him and he was a significant character in Memories of Ice, and then by the time it got to Reaper's Gale, I wasn't really caring much about his character anymore, and I feel a similar way about Toll, unfortunately. There was some interesting stuff within the Malazan perspectives in this last part. Bug gives Tavor a weapon at one point, and he specifically says something like, when you face your most dire necessity, look to this weapon, and Tavor reacted in a way that made it clear she knows what he's talking about, and she seems to be aware of something that she's going to have to do, but as the reader, I don't have a clue. At the moment, I'm thinking maybe she's going to have to sacrifice herself or something along those lines. It makes sense that that's why she didn't have a card within the Deck of Dragons reading. in. Quick Ben and Bottle also had a whole conversation about them going into the wastelands and how they're not sure what's going to meet them there. It has kept mentioning that there's a storm over this particular area with these massive rocks or hailstones that are coming down. It also keeps mentioning jade pieces in the sky. There was also a reveal around how Throat Slitter is a Talon, and there's another Talon within the Malazan army, but even Throat Slitter doesn't know who that is. I will admit, with the Malazan Marines, sometimes they all blur into one in my brain. Some of them, like Bottle, for example, Quick Ben, Fiddler, like more prominent characters, I have no trouble remembering, but a lot of them, they all seem to have the same personality, and so it takes me a while to remind myself who they actually are. There was a great conversation between Fiddler and Hedge earlier about how Hedge feels like Fiddler is being distant from him, and Fiddler says, well, yeah, because in my mind, you died, I grieved you, the bridge burners are no more, like it's all about the bone hunters now. And again, it's tying into that theme where Hedge seems reluctant to let go of the past. He's still living in that time, whereas Fiddler has evolved and moved on. The Errant is also struggling to let go. He's trying to bring together a group of people, including Knuckles, who we met in, I think it was Reaper's Gale, and we learn that he's an earlier version of Oppen, which I thought was really cool. Kilomandros is also part of this, and she was, again, someone that we met in Reaper's Gale. There was that Azath house under the sea. Ublala also has been given a task to complete. He was directed to dig up this armour, and he has been sent into the wastelands where everything seems to be converging. So I wonder how that is going to play out, because he was meant to get an army for Karsa, but he keeps forgetting that that's what he's meant to be doing. One thing I am a little bit confused about is we've got a group of people. I want to say they're a group of souls. I don't think they're physically there, because it's people from Reaper's Gale who I believe were either killed or they were absorbed by Icarium. Featherwitch is with them, but she's got a different name. I think her name is Breath. They've gone into this massive dragon, or underneath this dragon, which seems to be a keep of the Kachain Chamale. The Sheikh have also been on this journey where at one point they found themselves in the Tist Leozen Warren. The brother of Yantovis, is it Darren something? I can't remember his name, but he went up against these Tist Leozen and killed them. And there was a Forkruller sale with them, which felt a bit random. I do feel like that storyline has been quite rushed, and we seem to be checking in every so often, but already they have arrived at Carcanus, which is the Tistandi city, and it's dead. But the way that the chapter ends is with Yerin Derig, I think is his name. He goes into Carcanus, and that's how that chapter ends. Yeah, there's a lot that's going on. The witches of the Sheikh are still planning on betraying Yantovis, and again, betrayal seems to be a big theme within this book. As confused as I have been throughout some parts, it's a good confusion. It's not a I'm lost confusion and I don't care about any of this. I do feel like I'm invested in seeing where these storylines go. So I finished part 3, and if you've not read this book in a while, or if you don't know, this is the part that has the hobbling scene with the Barghast. And full disclosure, I knew that it was going to happen. After I read Reaper's Gale and I really hated Janeth's storyline, I was on Reddit, I was reading a thread that was talking about Janeth's story arc, but it also mentioned what happens to Hetton in Dust of Dreams. I didn't know the full details because the comment was kind of vague, but I was prepared for something to happen, and I don't feel it was gratuitous in the way that it was written. I could see the purpose in why it was written and how it was showing the Barghast culture. At one point, I think it even mentioned that Tool had this opportunity to outlaw or get rid of this practice and chose not to. So I understood why it was there, and also Sam sent me a link to an article that talks about this particular chapter, and Steven Erikson had commented on that article explaining why he chose to write that scene. I can understand authors wanting to reflect humanity in their work, because humans are capable of some truly horrific things. So I understand authors not wanting to shy away from that. However, for me, there is a difference between writing about something more broadly and putting a specific character through a trauma. I view those two things very differently, and when I come across them in fiction, there's certain ways that I want them to be handled. And if we go back to book 3, for example, with Memories of Ice, if the way that we had learnt about the children of the Dead Seed was through seeing a Malazan soldier, for example, falling on the battlefield, if that had been how we had learnt about that, I think that would have been very different to what actually happened, where we were just kind of told about it. It was still very uncomfortable and horrific. I think the two are very different. This is obviously just my personal opinion and what I prefer to read in fiction, but for me, if a character is going through a trauma, then I want to see the aftermath of that, and I want it to be a pretty significant focus, and I feel like Steven Erikson actually did that reasonably well in book 2 with Felison. The way her story arc was handled in Dead House Gates, and how you could see she was holding and carrying around a lot of anger, how her trauma had impacted her, I thought that was handled fairly well. There's some other examples I can think of, like with Seren, I felt like in Midnight Tides, and Udinaz actually, like how their traumas were handled. Initially after Midnight Tides, I wasn't sure how to feel about it, but then that was revisited in Reaper's Gale. Was it Reaper's Gale? Yeah, I think it was. So at least it was revisited in a later book, and it wasn't just forgotten about. Same with Stonny and what happened to her in Memories of Ice. We revisited her in Toll the Hounds. So hopefully what I'm saying is making sense. I appreciate it when an author doesn't just forget that a character has been through something. With Hetton, I can't help but think, why was it necessary for this particular character to go through this trauma, especially because she dies a few chapters later. Even when it was in her perspective and she was thinking about how these people, these women, seem gleeful about what's about to happen to her. I think this kind of ties back to what I was saying about how I feel sometimes with character arcs, there's too much time in the middle between when we're introduced to a character and when we see a character and the conclusion of their arc. I felt like Hetton in this book felt like a completely different person to who we met in book 3, but I wasn't there to see that development and to see her become who she is, you know, like she's a mother and she has children. I feel like I don't have much else to say actually on this part in terms of the other storylines. The Sheikh have arrived in Carcanus. There was something that was mentioned to do with the Tisliosan, and maybe they were responsible for there not being many Tisliosan now in the world. It seemed like they were holding back the barrier between light and dark, and that was kind of contributing to it. There's been a lot that's happened that has confused me, like the stuff to do with the snake and also the stuff to do with Akarium. I feel like I'm not quite following everything, but I'm hoping things are going to be clearer in this final section. I have now finished Dust of Dreams, and considering I had a lot of positive things to say about this in the first half, I'm a little disappointed that I didn't end up loving this one. It's not my least favourite Malazan book. I would probably put it in about 7th place, 6th or 7th place, something like that. I think the main issue that I had was with the pacing. I know that this is intended to be the first half of the end, and so I didn't expect the ending to feel super satisfying, but still, I felt like the whole book, the pacing was all over the place. For example, we're introduced to this character of Caliph in the beginning, and everything to do with the Kachain Chamale, I was really interested in learning about that. However, it felt like Caliph was off page for such a long time. When Gesler and Stormy snatched from the Malazan camp, and suddenly they're the mortal sword and the shield anvil, and I couldn't help but feel like that felt a bit rushed. I checked with Sam, and apparently there's some very subtle foreshadowing throughout the series, which he was obviously looking out for and was able to recognise. I didn't pick up on any of that, and so to me it felt quite jarring. There's obviously the big battle at the end between the Kachain Chamale and the Kachain Naruk, and the Malazan army gets caught in the middle, and that whole section, it was very cinematic. I liked how there were callbacks to, I think it was the Bone Hunters, where we saw there was an army of Skykeeps in the Imperial Warren. I think it was Kalam and Quickben who went in there and saw all of these Skykeeps. So I liked how that was coming back around and we had those callbacks. At one point I thought that Bottle had died, and I was thinking, wait, what? And I went back and read it and thought, oh no, okay, like the line was something like his soul left his body, and I realised he was doing that thing where he can put his soul into animals, or I think it's just animals. I don't know how it works, but I realised that he hadn't died. With Keneb though, I felt like that was very abrupt. Something also happened where Quick Ben was struck by a bolt of lightning. I don't think he's dead though. If that is the case, then I'll be quite annoyed, because I feel like that would be a very anticlimactic end to his character, considering he's been in the book, in the series, since book 1. There was also quite a lot of stuff with Icarium, where Featherwitch gives him the Eye of the Errant, which he uses as a finesse to grow an Azath house, or at least I think that's what's happened. That's what stops the Skykeeps from coming through into this world and what ends the battle. I don't think that's the end of Icarium though. I feel like it was left a bit open, but I mean, there's still so much that needs to happen with Icarium. We need a reunion between him and Mappo, because Mappo is now on this continent. I loved all of the very small part with the Trigal Trading Guild. I wish that had been expanded a little more, but we still have that needs to be resolved, as well as the children who were part of the snake that was going across the desert. They have arrived in, I think it's a glass city, the Icarium built, and it talks about how the heart of this city, or is it a mechanism? It was again a bit confusing, but it talks about how the heart is broken, so that has to again be resolved. So Icarium isn't gone, like he's going to come back in the next book. I know that. I also really liked how this eventually caught up with the timeline of Toll the Hounds, and we saw Draconis come back into it, and he meets Ublala Pung, and that was a duo that I wasn't expecting, but you know, I think that could be fun. Hood is also alive, and there's a point where we see him come back to life, I think, and there's a bunch of not dragons, I keep wanting to say dragons, they're Jaggots. So maybe there's something that's going to happen with that in the final book. We also got a little bit more of the Forkrull Assail, which is a group of people who we've heard about throughout the series. They seem to pass judgment on people, and they intervene when conflicts are happening, and we've seen that in the past. Still have a lot of questions around the Sheikh and the Tistandi and Mother Dark and everything that was happening there. So I feel like the final book is gonna be intense. There's a lot that I feel needs to be wrapped up, and I'm not expecting everything to be wrapped up neatly with a little bow, but I have so many questions even from previous books. There's a lot I feel that needs to be wrapped up in this final book. I did like how the ending of this part, it ends with Kilamandros and, is it pronounced Setral Lath? They decide to release the Otataral dragon, and I think that's going to cause chaos. Me and Sam are going to film a discussion tomorrow, which I will insert into the video next. If there's anything that I've forgotten that I want to talk about, then I'll talk about it with Sam tomorrow. I can't believe that I finished book 9 and there's only one more book left to go. Hi everyone, welcome back. Once again, I'm joined by Sam, who is going to be sharing his thoughts on Dust of Dreams based on rereading the series. Obviously, I am reading the series for the first time, so I think the first thing we should talk about, so I've actually just mentioned in the clip that I filmed yesterday, I was talking a bit about the foreshadowing, because there were certain things that happened in this book that I felt came a little bit out of nowhere. Not exactly, but for example, Gesler and Stormy being the mortal sword and the shield anvil. When I was thinking back on it, I was thinking there's got to have been some hints that this was going to happen that as a first time reader I was just not picking up on. So did you want to talk a little bit about that? Because we obviously had a conversation where you said, oh yeah, there were
yeah, there were a couple of hints. So in this book we obviously had the snake storyline, and Baydal, she seems to have this ability to astro project herself up in the air, and there was one scene where she was overlooking the bone hunters, and she noticed 2 bright flames within the camp basically, and in my mind that's Gesler and Stormy from book 2, you know, going through the Warren of Telan, seeming to ascend during that, and that's been hinted at throughout like the whole series, you know, being stronger than, you know, a mere human, etc. There was Also, the card reading that Fiddler had at the beginning of the book, they got 2 of the 3 Orb Scepter Throne. I can't remember.
I feel like
I think it was Orb and Scepter.
Yeah.
And back in book 1, when they were discussing the cards, I think at one of the first readings that we did, I think maybe with one of the majors back then, was that those Tattersall, one of those 2 cards are forms of power. Yeah. So it makes sense that they could be the Mortal Sword and the Shield Anvil. But there's also a moment in book 6 with the Bone Hunters when they were in Malaz Island, and one of the Telan Mas decided to arrive on the island to find its sword, which he'd left with Stormy after the events of Solana, when it went through to stop the Rent with a Tistandi head, and he referenced Stormy as the Shield Anvil.
Because I think in this book, Stormy says, "Oh, Shield Anvil, yeah, I've been called that at some point."
Yeah,
I haven't picked up on that or remembered.
Yeah, so again, it's only a very, very small foreshadowing, but there must have been a reason for it. But I picked up on that this time round, which was interesting, because at that in book 6 I was like, sure, that doesn't make sense to me. But now I know. Not too many hints, I don't think.
Yeah, not enough that me as a first-time reader was picking up on it. Because
I don't think I picked up on it the first time around at all.
Yeah.
So you're not alone there, probably.
Yeah, I feel like this book I liked how it focused quite a lot on the Kachane Shimala. I actually wanted that to be more, because one of my critiques of this book is it feels like it's doing a lot. Kind of like House of Chains, and I think Reaper's Gale was a little bit like this, where it felt like there was no one main focus. It felt like, okay, well, we're kind of following the Malazans as they're travelling across this continent. We're kind of dealing with this political situation with the Bolkandi, the Bolkando, the Perish, the Kundril, like that kind of area. And then we've also got this storyline with the Kachane Shimale and stuff. So I think that's why I kind of struggled with it a little bit, but then I also appreciate this is intended to be the first book before the end.
Yeah, I think this book is very different, and obviously Erikson prefaces this at the beginning of the book. This seems to be like a prelude to the Crippled God. So with a lot of his books, we get a lot of threads, but he weaves them all together towards the big ending at the end of each book. But we don't necessarily get this. We get, I think, probably one of the first big cliffhangers from any book that we've read so far, which he doesn't tend to do at all.
Yeah.
So it is very different. What I kind of liked about this book was with the Bone Hunters, I kind of felt like I was with them in the sense that I don't really know what's going on with what they're planning on doing. And you obviously saw that with all of the Bone Hunter POVs, maybe not Fiddler or Tavor, but they don't really understand why they're still there and what they're doing.
Yeah.
So I kind of felt, I empathised with that, which was kind of cool.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I really liked about this book is that Erikson, again, with these races, kind of changed our preconceptions of what we felt the Kachane Shimale were. He did that with, I think, the Telan Mas. I think he did that with the Barghast. I think he's done it with the Jaggets throughout this series. Yeah. And again, he's done it with the Kachane Shimale, where he's completely changed my opinion on what they would be in this series from the very beginning, where you thought these were just, lizards who just went to war and killed everybody. But now we've got a more of a sense of who they are and what they are. Which is, I think, really cool.
You talked a little bit about the Telan Mas, and that's something actually that I haven't yet, I don't think, talked about in the vlog. Obviously, with Toll and the ending and that kind of switch.
Again, with the Telan Mas, you get this opinion at the start of the book where you're really emphasising with this race of beings who have been in this perpetual war for however long, hundreds of thousands of years, fighting this enemy, the Jaggets, because in book 1, the main arch enemy is a Jagget tyrant. So you're thinking at the beginning of the book, Jaggets are bad, Telan Mas are good, right? But throughout this series, your mind changes because you think the Jaggets, they just want to be left alone at this point. They don't want this war, but the Telan Mas seem to be, in this zealot mode, this pogrom against the Jaggets. So you keep going through this motion of change, of gradually changing your opinions on these races. And when it comes to Tool, this is the first Telan Mas that you could properly emphasise with as a character. Because he was on his own. going through, finding a friend, Tok the Younger, going through what he did to try and rescue him from the matron in book 3, to then turning back into a human, like having a family, being the leader of these Bargas people who he doesn't really want to be, and then sacrificing himself to try and save his family and the Bargas that he was with from betrayal, or for him to then see his family die, try and go into the afterlife to try and see them once again, just for this Olar Ethel person who seems to be, like, you know, the leader of the person who created the ritual in the first place, to use his friend to stop him from doing that, and then basically breaking Tool for the first time we've seen in this series, and then he goes on a vengeance trip.
Yeah.
You know, which, is horrible.
You've also just reminded me, Masan Galani, when she is sent off to do something, obviously she's sent off, and then, is it Kisware is also sent off?
Yeah.
Am I right in thinking that she comes across the renegade Talan Imas, the ones that are remaining from, obviously, book 4? When we first met them, technically it was book 2.
Yeah, and a couple of them have died so far. One, I think, was with Hedge, and then one with Casa.
Because that was really cool for me, because I was like, oh yeah, like I hadn't forgotten about them, obviously. I knew that there were still some of them that were left over, and they keep popping up every so often.
Yeah, they do, but we don't know their motivations, because at the beginning of the book, we get a sense, I think, from the Eldar gods, when they're having their, you know, group conversation, their little powwow, that all of the crippled god's kind of allies have kind of turned away, like, because we've seen all of his schemes not work at this point, you know, with Rulad, with the Ida in general,
Panyan
Damin, them, like, that obviously didn't work out. The infection with Burn, you know, Quick Ben was able to stop that or halt it or slow it down with the Jaggets that he put in there. So yeah, we don't really know what's going on with the crippled god, apart from the fact that
the Bone Hunters, or at least it seems that's Tavor's plan, is to release the crippled god. Free him.
Which is really interesting, because you're thinking, like, what the crippled god has done so far. But again, you spoke about this, you know, in book 3, I think, where we learnt about, like, the chaining, like this crippled god being brought to the Malazan, not really of its own free will. It was brought down by those mages who were opposing Kala, you know, way back when. And it was brought down, it broke into pieces, and it's being chained to the earth by these elder gods, and the other gods. But
kind of feel sorry for it, you know. Didn't ask.
Obviously, he's done horrific things, but we know he's like he's gone crazy and he's a bit insane, because he's been in this position, you know, in pain for so long, and it's been given a name in this book. I think Kaminsod.
Okay, so if the camera angle has changed, it's because my memory card just ran out of space, so I've deleted some stuff. It cut out just in the middle of while we were talking about the crippled god, but I think we've covered most of that, and we then started talking about the Forkrull Assail. Basically, I think that the Forkrull Assail are going to play quite a big part in the next book, and it's interesting because when we were reading book 4, that's when I think we were first introduced to a Forkrull Assail. It was implied that there was a conflict between the Jagger and the Talanai Mass on Genebakis, and then the Forkrull Assail came in, and the Talanai Mass and the Jagger came together. They banded together against the Forkrull Assail, and I remember us talking at the time and saying that is pretty significant, because the Talanai Mass and the Jagger hate each other, so for them to come together against the Forkrull Assail, that must mean that the Forkrull Assail are, I don't want to simplify it by saying the bad guys, but clearly they aren't seen as a positive thing, even though they, throughout this series, have been presented as, you know, the justice bringers.
Yeah, but it's their justice.
It's like what you were saying, how your perception of the different races changes throughout this series, and so at the back of my mind, and I don't know whether I'm reading too much into this, but I'm thinking, okay, well, the Forkrull Assail, you know, they've not been presented as good people, you know. A lot of people they show up and they're like, but is that their prejudice?
Yeah, I think, you know, Silchas Ruin had talked about them way back in book 5 as well, when he was speaking to, I don't know who it was, but he was still in the Azath at that point, and he was talking about the Forkrull Assail and how difficult to kill they were, and again talking about their form of justice and how they, you know, destroyed people and lands and stuff to to abide by that justice. So yeah, I'm not sure.
Kettle, though, I'm sure she was a fork-cruller sale.
I think there was part of her soul might have been.
Because there was a point when she died where we were in someone's perspective, I can't remember who it was, and they said, oh, was it Trull? Why is Trull with a fork-cruller sale girl?
I'd have to go back and look up Kettle, because I know that the Azathians were preparing her from the very beginning to potentially be this seed for the finesse. I'd need to go back and look up that whole storyline, to be fair. But no, you're right. I think the fork-cruller sale will play a big part in book 10.
The way that I thought that this book was going to end, I had no idea it was going to be, like this battle. What I thought was going to happen was it kept mentioning the jade statues, like the jade sky. And so I thought that the jade was going to come down and like crash to, like into the wastelands, and that was going to cause some kind of chaos. So I was very wrong about that. But I still think that because of how often it was referenced, that has got to have some kind of meaning as well.
Yeah, 100%. We still think what that is in the sky is the Cripple God's followers.
Yeah.
Following into this realm to try and find their god. And again, we don't know what the fork-cruller sale's motivations are in using this piece of the Cripple God in Callan's. But they seem to be doing it for some reason. Don't know what, but yeah.
Heberic was also in this book.
Heberic was, so I think that's again more foreshadowing for book 10. But there's a lot of stuff which is open-ended so far, which hasn't been answered yet.
Kept mentioning that there was going to be a betrayal, and I don't feel like that happened.
It was heavily hinted at that something was going to happen and the Bone Hunters were going to be betrayed, and even the Destrin at the beginning of the book with the Perish, they said that they were going to be betrayed by her. But it hasn't happened yet.
My theory is that Tavor is going to do something that will technically be a betrayal, but it's going to be for the greater good. Yeah,
the problem is nobody really knows what Tavor wants to do.
No, because we haven't had any perspective from her.
No, and I think that's a really good thing that Erikson's done, because it's
very deliberate
decision to not reveal anything there. But yeah, what about those battles at the end?
See, I am not a big battle person, and I've had this, it's not just Malazan, it's other books as well. Like I have to concentrate very hard because I find myself getting a bit bored. But like I know that you loved it, and obviously there were some moments throughout that. I've already talked about some of them. I think where I struggle with the battles that involve the Malazans is that there are so many Malazan Marines, and a lot of them for me just feel like the same person. And they all have the same sense of humour, and so like something will happen, and like to one of them, and I think that's this person. This is one of, like, maybe it's one of the heavies, or I think this is the person that we met. The one that was, is it Karab who was following Leoman? There's certain like characters who I remember who they are. I see why you liked it, and I didn't think it was like a badly written battle scene. I almost have to pretend that I'm writing an English paper back in school when I'm reading those, and I'm kind of like analysing them, rather than, because for me it's not enjoyable reading big battle scenes.
No, that's fair enough. Yeah, I think the last 2 chapters in this book were some of the most like visually cinematic reading experiences I've had with Malazan so far.
Yeah.
Especially with like the Skykeeps and the rooted Skykeeps. That was just really well done, and I love when Erikson is writing these battle scenes with the Bone Hunters against the Naruk, where he's swapping from one POV to the other, but it's very short like POV vignettes, changes, which I just find his writing with characters is just really impactful. With some of the characters which we haven't been with for a while, such as Sunrise, where he was from Lether, he's joined the Bone Hunters, he's part of the Bridgeburners squad with Hedge, and we have only some very small bits of dialogue with him throughout this book. But when he sacrificed himself to save Hedge, that for me that was really, really impactful. When we thought like some of the characters were going to die, like Bottle, when he's talking about he's being ripped apart, going from one rival loci to another to try and attack these Naruks. Like I had a pit in my stomach, you know, when they said that Tar had gone down and nobody knew where he was. I think it's interesting because it is a 10-book series and there is so many characters, but I think if you put all of their dialogue, you know, back to back to back, I think you might like change your opinion. I think it's because it's so spread out.
Yeah.
It might be difficult to get invested from one character to another when it comes to the Bone Hunters.
That's what I struggle with so much. I actually talked about this earlier in the video. Like, that is the one thing for me. It's too much time in between continuing character arcs. But you're right, like probably on reread maybe it would be different.
I thought those two fight scenes were really, really well done when the Bone Hunters like held the line in the trenches, you know, hail to the Marines, when that line came up, with how epic that moment was with Quick Ben going into the phalanx ranks and blowing up, you know, hundreds and thousands of the Naruks, and then having one of the Skykeeps, I think, come down with like a bolt of lightning, and, you know.
See, I think for me as well, I am struggling to think of many deaths throughout this series that have stayed permanent. And that's not me saying, oh, the characters have plot armour, but it's things like Whiskey Jack's death. He's not necessarily like alive, but, you know, like he's now holding the gate to not Hood's realm, the Death Realm, you know, like, and the only death that I think really impacted me was Beak, because that did feel final. And I think that's why I'm struggling at this point in the series, because I'm looking back and I'm thinking, well, there's only been one death in this 10-book series, 9 books that I've read so far, one death that has impacted me. And so when things were happening for a brief moment, I've talked about this, with Bottle, I thought, oh, what's happened to Bottle? Like, has he died? And then I realised what was happening. And the same with Quick Ben. I am not convinced at all that Quick Ben has died. Like, I'm
no. I think that's very different though to like Whiskey Jack's death. When like the Whiskey Jack's moment, that hit me hard.
Yeah, I know.
He might obviously he has come back in the form of, you know, guardian of the realm of death now, the gate of the dead, but he still died, and for me that was still impactful, even when like Mallet died. Again, for me, really impactful. Or any bone hunter or any bridge burner that dies, like when Keneb died, really impactful. But I think this is just the way that Erikson writes characters, and I like it. You don't.
With Keneb, that was a moment that, because I liked Keneb as a character. I remember him when he was introduced in book 2, and I thought he was, you know, like a really interesting character. And so for him to just be like dead within a paragraph, I was like, well, hang on a minute, like that could have been really emotionally impactful, but instead it was just like, gone.
See, that was, for me, Erikson was just trying to shock you in that moment. It wasn't necessarily this drawn out moment of death where you kind of foreshadow it, seeing it coming. It was like a character you've been with for so long, and then he just, that's it. And for me, when I'm reading that chapter, I'm just like shocked. I had to take a moment and go, I didn't even remember that from my previous read, to be fair. I didn't know that was the moment Kenneth died. But when it happened, like, I paused, you know. And when I'm reading a book and the writer makes me pause, or, you know, makes me close the book, I can't like read any further. For me, that's when I know that the writing is really hitting, and that moment really hit for me.
Yeah, I get that. And I will say the build up to, you know, when the Malazans realise, and, you know, they're kind of like, oh, we need to get out of here, we're not meant to be here, you know. And as the reader, I was thinking, what's going on? Like, what's happening, sort of thing. I did think that moment was done well. I think I just wanted it to be drawn out just a little more.
Yeah, well, we haven't got, this is not the end, it's book 9.
I know, and I think that's what I keep needing to tell myself, is that if this was something that happened midway through a book,
we know there's going to be something else.
Yeah, and I think that's why, is that still psychologically I'm thinking of it as the ending of the book, and I was like, wow, that was over quite quickly. Yeah. And yet, if that was, say, you know, like in Memories of Ice, we had that midway point battle, or in the Bone Hunters, we had that midway point, you know, siege at Gigatan. If I think of it like that, then yeah, like, you know, it reframes the way that I'm thinking of it.
But again, I would still say it's the weakest of the 10. I still enjoyed it more, like I've done every book so far during the reread, but it's still the weakest structurally. I agree there's a lot of threads in this book which are too far apart, but I will say that the ones where, such as the Shake storyline and the Snake storyline, do kind of ramp up in book 10.
We are gonna wrap things up there because I feel like we've talked for quite a while. There was something else that I wanted to talk about and it's completely gone from my brain. So if I remember, then I will bring it up when we get to The Crippled God, which will be in about a week or two. We're going to start it. I'm not sure how long it's going to take us to finish it because it is, I think it's the longest book in the series, or is it? Have I made that up?
I think it's very close to like Toll the Hounds.
Yeah.
In terms of length.
Yeah, so it's probably going to take us a few weeks to read, but hopefully the final vlog for this series is going to be live in about a month or so. So look out for that and let me know in the comments any of your thoughts and feelings on Dust of Dreams. But otherwise, we will see you next time. Bye.
Ciao.